Tonight on the Charismatic Cheetah Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Steve Miller, an author, philosopher, and researcher who spent years studying the intersection of science, faith, and the afterlife. With a PhD and a passion for evidence-based inquiry, Dr. Miller has dug deep into near-death experiences. Not just the stories, but what they may reveal about consciousness, eternity, and the God who made us. Are they deception, hallucination, or genuine glimpses beyond the veil? We're diving in. You're watching the Charismatic Cheetah Podcast, where signs, wonders, and sound doctrine meet. If you please like this video, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. It really helps me out. Steve or Dr. Miller? I want to be respectful.
Call me Steve if I can call you Michael.
Perfect. Yep, you sure can. I don't have a PhD in anything except for maybe being I don't know. I'm definitely don't have a PhD in podcasting, that's for sure. So, but Steve, just for people who don't know who you are, could you just give a quick introduction to who you are and tell us about your book, or plug away? Shameless self-promotion is 100% okay on this channel.
Sure. I'll just say the reason I was interested in this issue was that I've always been a doubter and questioner. I accepted Christ as a sophomore in high school, didn't really have any doubts about the faith. Felt like God really changed my life. But as people came up with questions that I couldn't answer, some of my friends could just whisk them away and say, well, they're wrong. And I'd say, okay, well, how does evolution fit with Genesis 1-3? Or what about this atheist who's saying this? And I felt like the only way that I could, have any kind of peace of mind was to study them out. I'd pray, and I wouldn't just by prayer get back in the faith. But when I read through the New Testament, I saw they were all about evidence. Jesus never shut somebody down for asking for evidence. He was very nice to Thomas when he was doubting. He just showed him his hands after his resurrection. He didn't say, why are you doubting? You ought to just believe blindly. He never once said that. So I felt like it was okay to study evidence, and that was the only way at different junctures in my life that I could have a solid foundation for my faith. So very interested in evidence. So in my time in high school, I began reading a lot of pro and con stuff. In college, I went to five, and graduate school, went to 5 different schools, and particularly took classes that were either the ones that I thought Christians would have a hard time answering the questions. When I was at the University of Georgia, studied religion, philosophy, different things there, and also studied Bible in another college, and then 2 different graduate schools. And it kind of reads, if you read the courses, it's kind of like a God search, because you see all these courses and, the foundations of the New Testament and the Old Testament and arguments for and against the existence of God. So finally I came to a point where I felt really reassured of things. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that one of my relatives wanted me to read the little book, Heaven is for Real. And I read it really reluctantly, because I thought these experiences people are having, if they're anything, it's just a private evidence for that person. Couldn't be anything beyond that. And I read it, and sure enough, I just kind of came out saying, well, it's a really heartwarming story, but they wrote a book about it. I don't know this family. Maybe they're out for money. Maybe they're not. But there was a blurb that said from Dr. Long, who is a radiation oncologist. And he said, I've studied thousands of these experiences, and this is consistent with that experience. And I thought, somebody's been studying this stuff? I need to get into the research. I don't want to hear stories. I don't know who these people are telling the stories. I don't know whether to believe them or not. I want to see the scientists that have been studying near-death experiences. So I started off reading Dr. Sabom. He's a cardiologist who did not believe in near-death experiences and set out to prove that they were something just naturalistic. He taught at Emory University, taught cardiology. He's not just your average cardiologist next door, but an academic one. And he wrote this book, Recollections of Death, because he began studying his patients. And about a year into his study, he said, these people are obviously outside of their bodies. And I can tell you why he came to that conclusion if you want to go there, but I don't want to just keep talking. So you ask what you want at this point.
Oh yeah, no worries.
But that got me into it, and I ended up writing 3 books. I'm on my 4th book now. did a dissertation on deathbed experiences that's over 400 pages. And I just give this stuff away to people as PDFs if you're interested, because I'm not in it for the money. I would have made a lot more money per hour working for Taco Bell than writing these books.
Yeah, no,
Because
yep.
the research is endless, but I think this is so important since we're talking about eternity. I want to get the information out there.
Okay, let's just not I appreciate that because there was a book that came out. It was similar to Heaven is for Real. I don't remember what it is, but long story short, there's a father and a son. The son got in an accident, was in a coma for a long time, and he claimed that his son saw angels and had all these experiences in heaven, but they ended up being completely false.
And I
I
know
wonder,
the name.
is it Kevin
Malarkey, believe it or
Malarkey?
not,
Yeah,
Malarkey
yeah,
was their name. Somebody should have thought there might be something up with that one.
yeah.
But that's why I
What?
don't really spend much time reading the little paperback books of people telling their testimonies, because there's a possible motive there. To even
Yeah.
if they're not making it up, they may be exaggerating to try to attract a certain audience or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I appreciate that you're actually looking at the scientific research. So let's just get down to, I guess, the foundation of it. Uh, like, how would you define what is a near-death experience for people who, I mean, we probably have a general idea about it, but what is a near-death experience, and how does that differ from hallucinating, for example?
Sure. So a near-death experience is an experience that comes near death, but the person recovers from that. They're either resuscitated or just some natural way they come back. But most of these experience actually clinical death, which is cessation of heartbeat and breathing. And so that's what people like Dr. Sabom, him being a cardiologist, he said, okay, I know these people, when they experience cessation of heartbeat and breathing, that their consciousness just goes down in a matter of seconds, maybe 20 seconds. But even in that 20 seconds before, their consciousness is going. And he said they can't be experiencing anything while that's what before they get fully resuscitated and their heart starts back. So that's a near death experience. And the amazing thing is, you would think if a person is just out of it, they're going to have, if they experience anything, it's going to be some kind of a dream or hallucination that they're going to come back with. It's going to be very vague because they were going in and out of consciousness. And it surely shouldn't have a pattern to what they've experienced. They should just, I mean, my dreams, and I've actually thought through my dreams. I usually forget them within a few minutes after I wake up, but I'd write them down over a period of time. And there were just about all kinds of things that were basically stream of consciousness nonsense that kind of seemed real at the time. But when I woke up, I thought, oh, no, that was a dream, obviously, because it just didn't make sense. Uh, However, when a person has a near death experience, Raymond Moody, who wrote the first book on this in 1975 called Life After Life, he was astounded when he heard one experience when he was a student at the University of Virginia studying philosophy there. He met a psychiatrist who had had a near death experience. And the guy talked about vividly going to the other side, uh, seeing like angelic and demonic beings, seeing Jesus, and and coming back. But there was a series of things that happened there. Like you come out of your body, you may look down and say, "Oh, what's that down there? Who's that asleep? Oh my gosh, that's me. I must be out of my body." So you have this realization that you're out of your body. You may go through a tunnel and come out in some other world that's very beautiful, or could be very horrific, depending on what type of experience you have. During that time, you probably will spend time with deceased relatives. It's hardly ever reported that somebody sees a living relative, always deceased. This differentiates it from hallucinations that would happen with somebody taking a psychedelic trip like DMT or LSD. Yes, in both cases, people would see a sentient being, But when you dig deeper, the sentient beings in a DMT experience are much more likely to be talking insects or clowns. Maybe only 1% or so would mention a deceased relative. So the content's very specific, unexpected if this were a hallucination. And you may have a life review. You may come to a point of no return to where you know if you kept going, you would be in your final death. You make a decision to come back, and here you are. Well, nobody would expect, if this is a hallucination, for somebody else to say the same thing. So Moody thought, hey, I met somebody with a near-death experience, and look at this. This is very encouraging. But then when he began teaching philosophy, a student came up to him afterwards and said, this stuff is not really that interesting. You're teaching. Why don't you talk more about death and what happens? Because here's what happened to me when I got in this traffic accident. And he repeated, the same type experience. Moody said, come back into my office. Let's talk. After that, Moody collected about 150 different experiences, wrote his book, Life After Life, and there's like 15 or so just common things that happen. Then people began to study it overseas, and they would say, hey, these are the same things. Why? If this were a hallucination based upon just somebody's expectations of what happens in the afterlife, why with such varied expectations overseas, and men, women, atheists, theists, why would they all be seeing similar things if it defies typically their expectations of death? So I hope that gives you some kind of an idea of what we're talking about. Maybe at least 4% of the population, when surveyed in Australia and Germany and the United States, at least that would say that they've had a near-death experience. So that's 1 out of 25 people. If you have a big
Wow.
gathering at Thanksgiving, ask around at what kind of visionary experiences they've had, because and they're more than just near-death experiences. And you'll be amazed at people you know and trust that'll tell you about some uh, really thought-provoking visionary experiences.
Yeah, that's been my biggest, the thing that I've always kind of half believed in near death experiences, that they were genuine glimpses to the other side, whatever you want to call it. But I've always been a little bit skeptical. But I've heard the argument that, well, it's just like a hallucination. It's like if you give someone LSD or DMT, or they have it like. But the thing is, what gets me the most is how the reporters, they say that it's very real and tangible. It's not. So my history is with drug addiction, so I have hallucinated before quite a few times, and I've also had seizures and had weird dreams from that, and just I've had some stuff, and I can tell you that hallucinations are not real. They're very vague. They're very vague. They're very kind of cloudy, and they're kind of like stream of consciousness, kind of like a dream. And that's what struck me the most about these people were saying, that how real it was, to how they were seeing colors that aren't here, and stuff like that. And so I want to kind of touch on that. You talked about when they studied it overseas with different cultural contexts, they were seeing similar things. Can you break that down a little bit more for us? So people like Buddhists and stuff like that were having similar experience as, say, Christians?
Yeah, well, okay, let's start off with Christians, though, because people will say, oh, well, you just see these things because you're expecting that as a believer. But actually, we're not expecting those things as a believer unless we've studied near-death experiences. So these people that Moody, especially the ones he interviewed in 1975, that none of them had heard of other people experiencing this. What are you expecting as a Christian? Well, what you're expecting as a Christian is your final death. And so if you're expecting something, you're thinking, okay, I think I'm going to come before God. We're going to have a little talk about, Jesus and things like that, whatever your cultural and biblical imagination is that's going to happen. You do not expect that you're going to come out of your body and look down and see your lifeless body and, interact with deceased relatives and all that, immediately you're thinking you're going to be with God. So what we're seeing is that a near-death experience is not a final death. It's like a halftime rather than the end of the fourth quarter. So it's very different than a Christian would be expecting. So why are ours consistently something that we're not expecting if we're having a near-death experience? And then an atheist in America who says, I don't even believe in God. They're experiencing they're expecting boring nothingness after they die, but they have this vivid experience. Why? That they can't get around. So a lot of atheists become believers, at least in some kind of an afterlife, and the spirit leaving the body after they have these experiences. Then we go overseas. Pim van Lommel was a cardiologist in the Netherlands, and probably less than half of the people there even believe in the afterlife. So when he started seeing these of his patients having these experiences, he thought, my goodness, this is not what most of them are expecting. What's going on here? So he did a several-year longitudinal study where rather than just interviewing people who say they had an experience way back, he started interviewing patients at more than one hospital that had just had cardiac arrest to find if they had just had an experience. So a longitudinal study is a little different than a retrospective study. But interestingly, there you are in a very different culture in the Netherlands, very secular culture, and they've got the same elements that Moody found here in America. So, I mean, that's just something that's unexpected to a naturalist interpretation of a near-death experience. And let me tell you one example of the realer than real phenomenon, because I think that needs to be, somebody needs to take this and just sit on your back deck and light up your philosophical pipe and think about it for a while. Because so after I began to study all the studies, and I would start telling people I'm studying near-death experiences, then people, secular and Christian and everything in between, start telling me about their visionary experiences. Like I'd be in a master's program get-together. I teach at Kennesaw State University, seemingly very secular, talking to someone that I think has no interest in religion at all. And Sherry, my wife, would say, hey, what are you studying? And I would say, near death and deathbed experiences. And inevitably, somebody says, come out here in the hall for just a minute. Let me tell you about when I drowned as a 9-year-old or whatever, and I came out of my body.
Wow.
And I mean, this is a good tool to talk to people because when they have them, they know this was no hallucination. They were in some kind of real situation. So the way I know that I'm not dreaming is that upon awakening, that's more real than my asleep state. And I can say right now, we're talking to each other. I'm not dreaming about this. I know why it's more vivid than a dream.
Yeah.
Well, these people in near-death experiences are coming out of them, and they're sane people. They're smart people. There are all kinds of people that are having these experiences, and they're saying, no, it was real. So I told my pastor I was studying this. He said, you need to talk to our minister of men. He doesn't tell anybody about this experience, but maybe he'll talk to you. So I talked to him about it, and we're sitting across from each other in a room. And he was in a sepsis condition where it was give or take whether he was going to end up living or not. And he was visited by some angels, and they were talking about whether he was going to come back or not. And they decided, yes, he needed to come back for his family or ministry or whatever. And and indeed he did, of course. But he said, I was laying there, I couldn't communicate with anybody, but I knew I was going to get fine, and everybody out there was worried about whether I was going to make it. And I
Mm.
kept asking him, like a psychologist does, you ask in several different ways to get redundancy of a question. And I'd say, well, just how real was it? And he'd say, oh, it was real. It wasn't something that, and then later on I'd say, well, just how real was it? Was it kind of like a vivid dream? What was it? And finally, on about the third time, he just sat, he kind of pulled up over the table like this, and he said, Steve, it was real. It was just as real as me sitting across talking to you right now.
Wow.
And some people will say, no, it was more than this reality. And so I think that's something that's very powerful that we're seeing cross culturally, that these people can't deny that it was real. That's very different from a hallucination or a dream.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. So how does this challenge we live in a very naturalistic, materialistic, when we die, it's blank. There's no spiritual realm. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, but how does this challenge that materialistic, naturalistic perspective?
Well, for one thing, I would say there are many problems with naturalism. For one, to prove it, you're having to prove that there is nothing that is not natural or physical. And how do you prove that unless you examine everything in the whole world? So if
Yeah,
if you've really got a scientific mentality, you got to say, well, I've got to look for the evidence. Science is all about observations, and let's take different people's testimonies and what they've gone through and scientifically studies things like that. I really think that in the 1900s things had gotten very secular, and I think that that is breaking down quickly because of studies of things like near death experiences, study of neurology, many things, the areas of study that people are saying, you know, we've just ignored all these phenomena all these years because they didn't sound scientific, but now we need to study things like visions and miracles and all these, because these are not idiots who are reporting this. Very intelligent people who
yeah.
have been convinced by it. I mean, Mortimer Adler, senior editor for Encyclopedia Britannica, had a vision while he was in the hospital. Boom, the guy that started Alcoholics Anonymous, he was just
Yeah.
beside himself. He was ready to be institutionalized. What am I going to do? He calls out to God. Now, he was a smart scientific guy. The last thing he wanted was religion. But oh my goodness, he had an experience. That's why God is all over AA and NA,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because of those things. So I think we're kind of moving past. In fact, I would call this maybe a time of post secularism that we've
Mm.
been quickly moving toward, because so many scientists are saying naturalism doesn't explain everything. Um, but I mean, of course, obviously, okay. So Sabom's patients, the way he did this study published it in about 1981, I believe, shortly after Moody. Um, so what he did is he took his patients and he asked them if they had had an experience. He was sure that none of his patients had had an experience like this because nobody had talked to him. So about the third patient I think he talked to told him about this typical near-death experience. And he's like, why didn't you ever tell it to me? The guy said, are you kidding? You'd be the last person I'd tell something like this to. I mean, you're afraid your doctor's going to send you to the psych ward or who knows what. So they don't tend to talk about it. So he began this study to see, are people really coming out of their bodies? If they are coming out of their bodies, then materialism, naturalism is starting to be shaken to the core. And this, if you read this book, it's not like a popular book that Sabom wrote, Recollections of Death. He is just making observations. He's checking what the patients say against the hospital records, anybody else that was in the room when this happened. He's approaching it like a scientist because he is a scientist. So what he found out was when he asked his patients who claimed to have who experienced clinical death, shouldn't have been able to know anything, and yet they said they had this vivid experience, realer than real, near death experience. It indeed had these elements that Moody had talked about. And he would ask them if they came out of their body and looked down at their body, he'd say, what happened during your resuscitation? And he said, all the people who claimed to have left their bodies would say that everything they said checked out. And it's not the
Wow.
same way every time, it's different. Like one patient, I believe this was either him or Van Lommel, but he said he looked down. And he said that the surgeon kept like it was like he was flapping his arms, like he was flapping his wings. I don't know why he was doing that. And Sabom inquired of the surgeon, and the surgeon said, "Yeah, well, he would do that after had sanitized everything. He didn't want to touch anything, so he would point to things with his elbows." things like that.
Yeah.
He said, on every count, those people got everything right about their resuscitations. Then he asked a control group of his patients who experienced clinical death, but did not claim to have come out of their bodies in a near-death experience. What do you think happened during your resuscitation? And so when he asked that, the patients would say whatever they had heard from TV or other sources. Well, I suppose what happened, he said they would be wrong every time on major counts. So he said, you can't
Wow.
explain away those people who said they came out of their bodies as saying, oh, well, they just heard it on TV or what they already knew about it. It was about a year into his study. He said, these people are coming out of their bodies. So
Wow.
that's a challenge to naturalism. And then there are about 12 different evidential factors that I isolated from near-death experiences that are things that just shouldn't be true if this could be explained naturalistically. And I can go into whatever those you want if you want that go that
Yeah,
direction.
please. Yeah, please.
Um,
Or you can just list
one
a few
thing,
of them or whatever. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
all
I'll,
ears.
I'll I'll just hit a few of them. There have been studies of people who were born blind who shouldn't be able to see anything. They would say, we don't see black. We don't even know what black is. We just don't
Wow.
see anything. And when they talked to them about their near death experiences, they could indeed talk about things that they saw, the way things looked that they had never been able to see before. Now, why would they just be lying about that? It's not like they're writing books about their experiences. They're just being
Yeah.
interviewed by some academic. I can't see why they would lie. Children, I think, pose a problem to naturalists when they've had near-death experiences and deathbed experiences. They'll tend to come back if they saw angels on the other side. In our culture, we're taught that all angels have wings.
Yeah.
So in all the Christmas scenes, you see these angels with wings. Well, the Gospels don't talk about the angels having wings. There are
Mhm.
some heavenly creatures in the Old Testament that had wings. They're never called angels, but it's a part of our culture. Christians and
Right.
everybody tend to believe all angels have wings. So this little girl was dying of some type of cancer, I believe, and she started talking to her mom about the angels she saw around her. And she said, "Do you see them, mommy?" And she said, the mom wanted to identify with her, and the mom said, "Well, yes." And the child incredulously says, "So what do they look like?" And the mom said, "Oh, well, mine has these, beautiful wings." And the child said, "You don't have to lie to me. They don't have wings." And interestingly enough, now if somebody saw an angel with wings, I think an angel can appear however the way the heck he wants to. I mean, it's an incorporeal existence over there. They can
Right.
appear as they wish. But there was a scientist back in the late 1800s, the turn of the century, William Barrett. I've got a lot of my books back there. I forget the names of people, so I cheat.
Fair enough.
But William Barrett, a physicist, respected physicist, his wife he began to study these experiences and found that was common among children to see angels but not have wings. Another thing that happens is they'll see people that they didn't know had died. And so Sir William Barrett's wife was a physician. She came home one day and said, "I've got to tell you about this patient of mine who is dying after giving childbirth." And she started talking about seeing her father, that her father was telling her to go. Now, how do you know you're dying? I mean, I think everybody stays positive in the surgical unit, and they're trying to help you they're hoping you'll live, and some of these live, some of them die. But she was seeing people on the other side who were telling her to come with her on the other side. These are deathbed experiences, by the way, rather than near-death experiences. And but the kicker to this one was this: she said the lady who is dying said the name of her sister, Vida. He said, "Vida, why are you here?" She was obviously puzzled. She said, then she was excited to see Vida on the other side because Vida was still living as far as she knew. But then finally she said, "Father, I'm coming. Uh, I know you want me to come, so I'm coming." And she passed away. Thing was, when they talked to the relatives there, they said, we had kept the news that her sister Vida had died from her because we didn't want to upset her.
Oh,
She was in
wow.
such bad shape. So this is people track these experiences and have found a lot of these where people would see somebody that they had not known was deceased. So that's just another line of evidence. You keep
Wow.
putting these together, and at least a dozen for near-death and deathbed experiences, when you look at the observations, to me it fits much better with the afterlife hypothesis than the dying brain hypothesis. So if it's just a dying brain that's squirting off some kind of DMT as you're dying, then
Yeah.
how are you able to tell what's going on outside of your body? Or how are you able to see somebody that you didn't know was dead? And that's typical of deathbed experiences where people see someone come by just after they've died, where they didn't know they had died, but they came by in some spirit form. This was studied extensively by some guys from Cambridge University. How do you know that when you're not having visions of this person every day, or different people every day? Then all of a sudden you have this very realistic vision where you say, I think this person died. And then this might have been in the 1800s or whenever, and they don't even get a telegram until much later that the person
Right. Yeah.
died, but maybe they
Yeah.
wrote it on their calendar because it was so vivid. So there's just a lot of evidence there that doesn't fit with the dying brain hypothesis, saying it's just a naturalistic hallucination.
Interesting. Well, that's fascinating, especially the blind people born blind, seeing people and objects and things and colors that they don't even know what black looks like because they see nothing.
Put it in your philosophical pipe and smoke on that one. You got to think about it. What
Yeah.
could cause that? And be skeptical. Ask all the
Yeah.
skeptical questions. I've read the Susan Blackmore and others that comment on near-death experiences. Read the other side. Read both sides, because we don't want to get into some kind of heresy here, and compare it to
Right.
the Bible if you're a Christian. Uh, and even if you're not a Christian, compare it to the Bible, because even if you don't believe the Bible, just take it to be a wisdom tradition over a period of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that's got a lot of wisdom in it.
Yeah.
Compare it and make sure that there's not something hokey going on here, where it could be a delusion by a demon or whatever.
Yeah. So that's actually perfect because, we kind of talked about the scientific side of things, the evidentiary side, but now I want to kind of transition a little bit, and it all kind of comes together, but regardless, but kind of looking into the theological side of things. So how do NDEs, I guess, how do they line up with what the Bible teaches about the afterlife, or does it, or do they?
Sure. Well, I'd say it's a subcategory of visions. And I was going through, just starting in Genesis, went through the whole Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and just said, okay, what kind of evidence was God giving back then? And all through it were visions, visionary experiences. You go all the way through. You go into the book of Acts, people having visions after the resurrection of Jesus, not just of Jesus, but Cornelius saw an angel, who told him. The Apostle Paul was one time hanging out somewhere, I forgot where, but he had his experience where he heard someone calling from another place. Okay, well, these are not visions that are giving new doctrine. And some people who, um, think that God only did these in certain times are usually afraid that, oh, you're getting into people giving new doctrine. But typically, a lot of these visions of the Bible were not about new doctrine. It was just giving direction or whatever. So I think visions is one of the big ways that God was working. But in my circles, I assume you're charismatic because of the
Yeah.
charismatic cheetah.
Sure
I'm
am.
not charismatic. I'm not against the gifts or anything. I just don't have any of those gifts, and have always been in other circles. Maybe I've just been hanging around the wrong crowd, but I think it's not about new revelation, but there are various reasons that people were having visions through the Bible, and a lot of it was just very personal. But specifically, looking at specific types of visions, you do see Stephen in the New Testament just before his death. He looks up and he sees, the son sitting by the Father, And there he is being welcomed into heaven. That's a classic deathbed experience. Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, I'm not sure if that was a near-death experience. We know he did come close to death at times in his life. Maybe this was a near-death experience because he says, I don't know if I was in the body or out of it, but he called it paradise and he called it heaven. So he was in the third heaven, he thought. So here Paul was outside of his body in, at least he thought that was possible, that he was outside his body. So you can't say that's heresy for somebody to come out of their body before death because he came back from it, right? So I think we have, and then we also have things like when Jesus had his transfiguration. That was a significant event. And he saw two Old Testament figures long since dead, but they appeared to him. Well, that's called an after-death communication. We see it in the Bible. Well, that's a kind of deathbed experience that I put in that same category. But those are a huge amount of people who've had deceased loved ones will say that they saw these loved ones. And again, it wasn't to come back and communicate, okay, here's what heaven's like, here's the correct doctrine, here's what's right about Protestants versus Catholics. They don't even go there. It's just usually assuring them that they're okay on the other side. It's almost like there's kind of a, okay, don't talk to anybody about the doctrinal stuff. Just like the Apostle Paul. When his vision, Jesus didn't give him the four spiritual laws, how to get saved and this and that. He sent him to somebody else because that was the duty of people to spread the gospel. So I think this is very consistent with visionary experiences in the Bible, which were of many kinds. And we have some specific examples. And the Bible nowhere says that all visionary experiences are of the devil or that all near-death or deathbed experiences are of the devil. So I think when people are proclaiming this, they've stepped beyond the scriptures, and we're not supposed to go beyond what is written according to the scriptures. But that doesn't mean that we're naive and we accept them all. In 1 Thessalonians 5, the Apostle Paul talks about, to test all things. Don't just ignore them all and quench the spirit, but don't just accept them all and be naive, but we need to test them. How do we test them? Well, for Christians, we're going to say, does this stand up with what God communicated already in the past in the Bible? If some angel comes to you, according to Paul in Galatians 1, and an angel comes to you preaching to you a different gospel, let him be anathema. Don't accept that. So it needs to line up to what God doesn't contradict himself. Does it line up to what he said in the past? Does it bring good character? Does it, so you have certain things that you're looking at to see if this is authentic or not. Did it bear good fruit?
Yeah, amen. What's funny is that you keep answering, like I'll ask you one question and I have my next question answer, like lined up, and you answer that one too. I'm like, oh dang it, now I gotta skip around here.
I promise
I'm not
a psychic. I never went there. But maybe that's directing us. We'll test this thing and see.
Maybe, yeah, maybe so. I think so.
And I wrote a whole book on that because that's a good question. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered because there's some Christians who are very dogmatic that these things are either people are making them up or they're of the devil. But what I find out is when I read these Christians who are saying those things, inevitably they've just read some paperback books of people's experiences, some of which are very new age or way off the mark, and they're trying legitimately to warn people of the that you shouldn't be believing everything. But typically these Christians who are writing these things against near-death experiences have not gone in to the research on experiences, which is much more pure than this fluff that you see going all around, or just watching a bunch of YouTube videos. We don't know those people. They may be just trying to build up their their visitors, and they may say things to exaggerate things so that they'll get a higher rating than others. And another warning about just watching a bunch of YouTube videos on this is that I believe that the algorithm of of YouTube and of Google is going to prioritize the experiences that are outside of the normal experience. So you're going to get more new agey things like people coming and saying, "Oh, when I went to the other side, I realized that there are many lives and this is just one of them, reincarnation." Or I got to the other side and I found out that all religions are wrong or all religions are right. And you'll see these things. And if you just go through YouTube, you'll find a lot of those. Why? Because the boring core experience that everybody experiences is not the one that people are going to like, which ends up being prioritized and fed to us. So you really need to stay with the core experience that's been confirmed through research.
But I want to kind of let's maybe I guess kind of transition to like the apologetic side of this thing. So how can Christians use near death experience? Because this is scientific. This isn't against scripture. This isn't necessarily heresy right off the rip. Just because someone has a near death experience doesn't mean that they're automatically a heretic. As long as they're not trying to spout new doctrine or something like that, they're probably okay. How can we use this as an apologetic tool to people who are atheists or people who are other religions?
Sure. Since near death experiences are experienced by people regardless of their religion or whether they're secular or spiritual or whatever, this gives us an area that people are interested in, that they're often willing to talk about. Even if they have not had that experience, they may have had a family member who's had that experience. And so often they want to talk to somebody like that about it, but they're afraid people will think they're crazy or naive or whatever.
Oh
And if
yeah.
they find out you've been studying this, a lot of people have a hunger to talk about it. And if Christians don't talk to others about it, they're going to go to some new age person who loves to talk about it with them, but they might be led astray into these weird experiences, anomalous experiences rather than the core. And so I think we need to be talking about these. I've never heard, as I can recall, and I've been going to church. I'm 68 years old, been going to church all my life. I don't know if I've heard a sermon that talked about contemporary visions. They'll talk about the visions in the Bible, but we tend to ignore it. Now, maybe in charismatic circles, you get a lot more illustrations like that. And I hope so, because people need to be, if you're a pastor, please look through this theologically and look through these visions going on today, because people in your congregation want to know about them and they're having these experiences. So I said that near death experiences happen to maybe 4% or more of the population. Deathbed experiences in a hospice unit, an indoor residential facility in New York, some physicians began asking the patients each day, this is hospice, they're dying. They ask them every day, have you had any religious experiences or visions? And over 80% of them would report things like visiting with deceased relatives or visiting with angels or visions of heaven. Over 80%. So
Wow.
typically, if you start talking about this and just saying to your family, I'm kind of interested in these near death and deathbed experiences. What do you think about? Here's one I heard about or read about. What do you think of this? Inevitably, what's going to happen is people within your family, people that you know and trust, are going to say, Aunt so and so, when she was dying, had this experience. I was talking to Lee Strobel. He put a chapter in his recent book on deathbed experiences and interviewed me on it. I was very honored. Lee Strobel's a great person.
Yeah.
And but he talked to his wife and about what he was studying. And she said, "Oh yeah, don't you remember?" And she talked about a relative who, on the deathbed, had said something about visiting with someone on the other side who she did not know had died. And Strobel's like, Strobel's been into evidence ever since he became a Christian, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet they weren't talking about these things. My own wife, Sherry, I was talking to her about deathbed experiences one day, and she said, "Did I ever tell you about that vision I had of my grandmother dying before she ever got sick?" And I said, "Well, no." And she said, "Well, when I went to the funeral, it was about 5 months later. She wasn't diagnosed until after her vision with advanced breast cancer. When she died, she said, I went to the funeral and it was set up just like I'd seen it in the vision." And I thought, why haven't we talked about this stuff? But I think what you'll find is, number one, people are very intrigued with these type of experiences, whether they're secular or spiritual or whatever. They want to talk to someone about it, and it's a great. It's just very persuasive. I teach in a secular or public university, Kennesaw State University, and I have them read a little book of mine called Faith That's Not Blind at one point, kind of the first half of the intro to religion class. And I've got Muslims, I've got atheists, I got Christians, I got kind of everything, Mormons, everybody in between in there. But I want to make sure they understand why religious people believe. So in my little book, I have 17 arguments for God's existence that intelligent people have said were impactful to them. And so I just have like a page and a half or 2 pages on each one. But they read it and I'll say, rate these arguments on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 being, I don't see any evidence at all there. 10 being, wow, this is entirely compelling. And what I found is that near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, and miracles are tend to come out toward the top. Now, another thing I found out was none of those arguments are a dud. At least one student will say, wow, I think that argument is the best, or it gets a 10. So different strokes for different folks, but I'm finding a lot of my students put a lot of stock in these experiences that are going on once I just briefly tell them the evidence for it. So it rates high on the compelling scale with a lot of people, which means we ought to be using this as we talk to people. We're talking about life and death. That ought to be interesting to you because last time I checked, the mortality rate in Georgia was 100%. Everybody was going to die. So people think about these things and they're interested in these experiences, and they've often read some stuff about it, some of it just fluffy nonsense, some of it real, but they enjoy talking about it. So why not use this as an introduction to talk about spiritual things? And I think the evidence is really quite compelling once you get into it.
Man, I love that because that's exactly how I feel about aliens, Nephilim, ghosts, like all the fringe stuff that, really up until recently, the church in general has avoided. That's how, like First Enoch, stuff like that. Like that's stuff that I'm kind of like, I like to study that stuff from a Christian perspective. And I love that answer because I feel the same way. Like unbelievers and people from all religions are talking about. They're talking about near-death experiences. They're talking about aliens. A lot of them now are talking about First Enoch, and and also seeing these beings when they do like DMT or something like that. So I love that. I love that we can use something like that as an evangelistic tool because if we don't have an answer for it, then someone else does. You know what I mean? Like someone
Right.
like has questions about near-death experiences, they're going to get on YouTube. And if Christians aren't talking about this, some new ager who maybe did have a genuine experience, but maybe they didn't see God. Maybe they saw the enemy instead, and now they're going to learn that from them. So I love that answer.
And I've had the only visionary experience I've had, if it was one, was negative. So when I was in studying in Bible college for the ministry and had a very vivid dream of Satan torturing me, and
Wow.
whenever I would call out to God, he would just laugh. And I woke
Wow.
up and it was so real to me. I went out in the hall. I was living in a dorm with other people and just wrote down, this was a radical dream, or was it a dream? And I just wrote it down because it was so powerful. I didn't tell anybody because I thought this is not edifying. Why would I tell
Right. Yeah.
anybody about this? But not until I began studying near death and deathbed experiences and seeing that a lot of these are distressing, that I think, and sometimes there's demons just laughing at people because they're deceiving them and whatever, and telling them all kind of false things, frightening. And I thought, well, this actually makes sense that, hey, here I am, a Christian going into the ministry. Satan knows that I struggle with doubts. Well, what could make me doubt more than to give me some vision of Satan torturing me and God's not helping me? So
Wow.
now I
Yeah.
look back and I say, wow, this makes perfect sense. I mean, Jesus was tempted by the devil. Why would I think I would be immune to something like that? It kind of makes sense now in retrospect when I look back at the Bible and I'm thinking, whoa, okay, this makes sense. But it didn't make that much sense at the time. The Muslim world is a good example. So many of them are reporting seeing a man in white. They end up getting led to some Christian believer to find out that the man in white looked just like he was described in Revelation or another book of the Bible. And many are becoming Christians. I've actually talked to someone who is on the field about this. Actually, several friends who've worked among Muslims, and I can't tell the locations because it gets dangerous talking about it.
Yeah.
The word can't get out. But there are many Muslims coming to the faith. In fact, I just talked to a pastor that I served with as co-pastor in a Bible church, and he was telling me about an experience with his somebody, 5, I believe it was, Muslims had the same dream in the same night and became Christians because of it.
Wow.
So
That's not the
this is
devil.
something that people want to talk about, but in the 1900s, for some reason, we just didn't really breach the subject among people. I think we were afraid that they'd think that we didn't know psychology or we're off our rocker, who knows what.
Yeah. No, I love that. I kind of had my own experience one time. I was a brand new Christian. Wasn't near death, but it was definitely a dream that absolutely came true. Like the next day, I had a dream that I was going to get in a fight with not even my boss, but a guy that worked with my boss sometimes. It's a long story, but I mean, I had a dream I was getting this big argument, and it was going to cause me to get an argument with my boss at the time. And I actually called someone. I was on my way to work. I called a mentor of mine. I was like, "Hey, I had this dream." He was like, "Oh, it's interesting. Maybe try to avoid conflict today or something." And sure enough, I'm in a full blown argument with my boss over the guy he was working with or whatever. And like in the middle of this whole like argument, I'm like, "Oh, this is exactly how I dreamed it last night."
Wow.
It was really interesting. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And of course I tell, cessationists that today, and they're like, oh, you had a deja vu. I'm like, no, but I called someone. It wasn't like I just deja vu. I called,
Yes.
it's verifiable.
Well,
I called
and
them.
that's what we do as thinkers. Proverbs is all about knowledge and thinking and all that, and not being naive. The naive believes everything,
Yeah.
Solomon said. But there you go, looking at it and say, now wait a minute, I called somebody in the middle of that
Yeah.
thing. So that's an evidence that it's just like the nobleman's son who was healed at a distance. And so he's walking home, his servants come by. Jesus had said he was healed. And the servants come and say, wow, he's better. He's fine. Your son's fine. And so what does the nobleman do? He's a smart guy. He's a thinker. He's a skeptic, right? He says, at what time did he get better? And at
Yeah.
that point, it was the same time when Jesus said that. So I
Yep.
think we need to look more at evidential factors regarding visions. There's often accompanying evidence that these things uh, couldn't have happened,
Yeah.
naturalistically. I have
Yeah.
a cousin, Bucky, that I respect, and I told him I was studying near-death experiences, and he told me about his, which was really a deathbed experience. But he was sleeping at night. And this is a relative that I see at gatherings. I trust him fully. No reason for him to be lying to me. He said about 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up, felt like a train had just dumped on his chest or something, came out of his body, saw some angelic beings, saw a tunnel in the corner of the room, came back into his body, and woke up in a cold sweat. Immediately, he got a phone call from a far off hospital, maybe a couple of hours away, from a nurse saying that his dad had just died of a massive heart attack.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
it's not like Bucky has those dreams every night, and you could say, oh, okay, well, this is just the night it tended to happen. But when he has this extremely vivid dream that he wakes up in a cold sweat and it's immediate, that's a miracle of timing as well as a
Yeah.
miracle of a vision. And when you put those together, that's starting to build a cumulative case. And then when you see that happen in a lot of other people's lives, like I try to bring together in my research, you're saying, okay, you can't just explain this as being a 1 out of a billion thing that happens. And, weird things happen. And hey, here's one of them. But if it's happening to a lot of people, a high percentage of people, then you got to say it makes sense to say that something's going on here that's spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, we're almost at an hour, so but I want to how do you want to what do you want to leave off with? Like how do you want to put a bow on this episode? Do you want to maybe resources you to point them towards, or just something, maybe an experience, or maybe a story that you heard or that you've encountered in your research? So you want to, whatever you want to do, time is yours.
I was at a major cancer clinic where my brother, with my brother who was suffering from an illness, and he told a nurse there this was in Houston. All of a sudden, the name of the clinic flew from me. You may know it, but it's one of the top, probably the top cancer clinic in the world. So the he told the nurse who was working with us what I studied. And she said, let me tell you about what happened when there was this girl, and I think she was about 9 years old, who was dying. She said, I used to work in a trauma unit. This girl had come in who had gotten burned all over her body. It was very serious. And then she said, I looked over and her spirit came out of her body, and you could see she was dressed in white. She was perfect. She was not burnt. And I just saw it come out of her body. And she said, I've not told anybody about this except my parents, maybe her husband, I think. But she said, I know what I saw. And she said, a chill just runs down my spine, every time I think about it. And I thought, there's no reason for her to be lying to us about this. She's a very professional person in a top cancer clinic, and she's telling about her experience, which has happened to others as well. And to me, that's sort of become an analogy or something to how I've felt, where I've studied apologetics all my life. And I know this stuff about the historical evidence for the New Testament being accurate, the historicity of the Bible and things like that. I've worked through a lot of those things. But I think that this thing of near-death and deathbed experiences has just put the icing on my apologetic cake, so to speak. It's kind of reintroduced that hair raising on your arms, the what did the Bible call it? Visions and miracles and wonders, signs and wonders. They're signs because they point towards something beyond the natural. They're wonders in the sense that they give you that hair raising on your arm, chill going down your spine, wonder that makes them extremely compelling. So all of a sudden, I'm in a point in my life where I just don't have any more doubts. I mean, I thought about it the other day. I thought, now that I've gotten into this, now it's not that I didn't need those other apologetic, things going on as well earlier in my life, but this, to me, has been the clincher. I just can't explain this stuff unless you bring God into it. And I think when you stay with the core experience, it's very consistent with the scriptures. So I've got 3 books. I go by J. Steve Miller, the letter J. Steve Miller. One on near-death experiences as evidence for the existence of God in heaven. One on deathbed experiences as evidence for the afterlife. And then a third one on is Christianity compatible with deathbed and near-death experiences. And if you don't have enough money for it, just shoot me an email at jstevemiller@gmail.com. And I'll send you a free PDF. I just want to get this information out there. I'm not in it for the money.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great conversation. Hour definitely went by quickly. But we'll definitely have you on again. Maybe we can talk about the more negative experiences with hell, or we can talk about deathbed experiences or something like that. I look forward to it. Also, I'll send me whatever links you have too, and I'll put them in the description of this video. Thanks for watching the show. And if you want one of these cool Charismatic Cheetah t-shirts, a link will be in the description. Also, Patreon, if you want to support me financially, will be in the description. And also, I have St. Michael Heiser shirts as well, if you want one of those. All of it will be in the description. Please like this video, but above everything, please share this video, especially with someone who might be skeptical of God or the Bible, or maybe they're New Age or something like that. Share this with them and have them look into Steve's his books and content and stuff like that. And please, if you've had your own experience, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Thank you, Steve, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Oh, thank you.